chatting with you about afterward. So let's see, how do I there? Okay. So Sarah just gave me a wonderful introduction. This is my family that she was mentioning. Again, went away to school for chemistry. I met my husband in a postdoc in Colorado. We have our two kids. Here's Mark, and there's Annie. Um, and I, after retiring 32 years, I decided I really wanted to do something different. A lot of people retire and they really enjoy what they're doing. Well, I did, but I wanted to learn new things. Um, so I've been with the support of my family and my sister Jeanette here, and my two four-legged family that you heard Lizzie just a few minutes ago. They've been helping me reinvent myself. And part of that reinvention is what I'd like to talk about today, the joy of native plants. I just as a note, I did take all the pictures in this presentation except for one, and it's marked with two blue stars. If there's one blue star, that means I took it, but it's not in my yard. So all of this is in my own yard, having a lot of fun there. So it all starts, we bought our house in Old Niskayuna here about 35 years ago. And between work and family, I really didn't spend any time on the backyard or the yard at all. It did what it did, it was what it was. But when I retired, I thought, wow, that was my chance. I would just love to be able to sit in the backyard, enjoy the birds, sit by some beautiful flowers, read, and maybe even have some friends over for coffee. So I got a bird feeder and I put out some bird seed and I got sparrows and squirrels. I was recommended that I may try better seed. I did, and I got more sparrows and more squirrels. Um, and that was that. I tried planting some perennials, and the only thing really perennial about them was that I planted them every year. So, as dreams go, that was a bit of a flop. But um, as soon after that, I heard about the Master Gardener program, and my sister thought I should try out for it, but I thought to myself, I'm anything but a gardener. But after a little more conversation with her, I said, geez, I'd love to learn. That's something I've always enjoyed, growing things. Why not give it a try? And it was just outstanding. It was a great experience, and it totally changed the direction of my retirement. Um, I loved the people I met. I loved the instructors. I loved what we learned. And one of my favorite lectures was on pollinators and native plants, given by my mentors and I hope also friends, Angie, Janet, and Kathy. Um, they really inspired me to want to learn more, and it's that journey to learn more that's led me to where I am today. And I want to thank them profusely. So you started, what is a native plant? What do we mean by that? And it's plants that are, it's been defined generally as plants present in North America before European settlement. Now, why pick that time point? Well, that's because that's the point of the first major human disruption. Humans are the biggest disruptor in ecosystems, and that before that point, we can assume that the species were co-evolving together over millions of years to that resulted in healthy, very well-functioning ecosystems. Examples of some native plants would be the white oak, sugar maple, river birch, some herbaceous New England asters, goldenrods of many types, all native plants to this area. Now, a non-native plant is a plant that was introduced. It may have naturalized into the environment outside of our yards, but it really doesn't have that evolutionary history with the species around it. But this plant has no detrimental effects on the environment, at least not yet. Examples would include Queen Anne's lace, lilacs, dandelions, many, many others. And then the invasives. I'll read this. Invasive are plants that are not native and that have a tendency to spread to a degree believed to cause damage to the environment, human economy, or human health. Now, for plants, it's typically just damage to the environment. But I want to make a point here. It's not the plant's fault. It's a great plant. We selected it most likely because it was beautiful before we imported it. But what we've done is we've taken the plant out of its natural environment where it had controls and natural controls and predators, and we put it in a place where it does not or may not. And then it can overcompete with the native plants here because it has no predators. Two examples would be native plants in our understory, in our forests. Deer love them. They're easy food. And when we have so many deer, our native understory plants are disappearing and they're being replaced by invasive species like buckthorn, burning bush, and honeysuckle that the deer will not eat. They did not co-evolve with those plants. They don't like the taste of them. They don't eat them. So because the deer are eating the natives, the invasives are taking over. And you can even just go as far as Central Park and you'll see that happening. The other second example is our Norway maples. You know, maybe in Norway or where they come from, they need to make a trillion seeds to survive. But when they're here, they make a trillion seeds and we get roughly a trillion Norway maples. And they outcompete and are taking over, they've naturalized and are taking over a lot of forests. So those are two examples of how invasive plants can be so damaging. So after having learned that, I rush home to my yard, grab iNaturalist, and I look and I go, oh my goodness, maybe. I have one of the best collections of New York State invasives you might want to find. And if I didn't have it, my neighbors did with Japanese knotweed and Phragmite. Um, so here I have a dying elm in the back, a scarlet oak that I planted, and two eastern white cedars, arborvitae, that were probably planted when my house was built. But the rest is like a who's who of the native plants or of the invasive plants of New York State. But they're beautiful. Um, there's tons of flowers. Where are the pollinators? There's tons of berries. Where are the birds? Where is all the life? Um, and what I learned in my Master Gardener class was when, you have a mystery in nature, one of the first places to look is the food. Like with humans, in mystery, you look for the money. In nature, you look for the food. And here's a trophic diagram that shows the simplified version of the food web or the food chain. And it starts at the bottom where you have the largest biomass in the top of the apex predators, where there's less biomass, and shows the energy flow. So plants are at the bottom producing there are the food producers for this food web. They take the sun's energy, convert it to sugars and carbohydrates, and then the energy flows up the chain through different mechanisms. The herbivores will eat the plants. The carnivores will eat the herbivores that have eaten the plants, and then that moves up the triangle, up the pyramid. A lot of interesting things you can learn from this, even this simplified version, but one of them that has become apparent is that it's not so simple. There are preferred paths and predominant paths, and one of those dominant paths is the the passage of energy into the animal kingdom occurs primarily, plant energy into the animal kingdom occurs primarily through insects. It does not occur through animals, through any other herbivores, or from the animals eating the plants, but predominantly occurs through animals eating insects. So, surprisingly to some, insects are the most efficient pathway for the transfer of energy up the food chain. Okay, so what insects are most important for that food chain? The first is pretty obvious, and that's the pollinators, because pollination is simply the transfer of pollen from the male to the female parts of hopefully another plant. And 80% of all plants need pollination to reproduce. Interestingly, 90% of all flowering plants need pollinators. And plants spend a lot of energy in producing a flower. And producing a flower, the purpose of flowers is primarily to attract pollinators. So they design the plants, the flowers, excuse me, they design the flowers both the shape, the size, the design, the fragrance, all to attract specific pollinators that they have co-evolved with. Now, 10% of flowering plants have decided that that's a bit too much trouble. And what they've done is simply make their pollen lighter weight so that it can be wind pollinated, um, which is a lot less energy expense on the flower. Unfortunately, wind pollination is much less efficient. Um, and so that they have to produce a lot more pollen to pollinate each other. Um, excuse me, I'm running out of breath here. Luckily for us, with our allergies, only 10% of flowering plants um, are wind pollinated. So, what are the best pollinators? Um, well, by number, they're most likely honeybees, right? Because we actually raise them. But if you look at insect or bee by bee, it's really the native bees that are our best pollinators. Now, that doesn't warm the hearts of many people because bees really aren't well liked. When we think of bees, what we think of is a queen, a hive, and honey. But that's specifically honeybees. And honeybees aren't native. Um, we also, when we think of bees, we think of bee stings. Um, and when we think of singing bees, we aren't really, again, native bees at all. They're most likely honeybees, wasps, and wasps would be yellow jackets, hornets, or paper wasps. And all of those insects are protecting large hives. Native bees, on the other hand, are primarily solitary bees. Only 5% of native bees live in hives of any sort, and those are the bumblebees. And bumblebees tend to live in hives of about 1 to 200 bees versus the 40,000 of the honeybees. So they have very little motivation to defend their quote unquote nest. So when you think of native bees, instead of that honey and hive and queen concept, it's best to think of a single mom. Native bees are really single females that nest in either cavities in stems or they nest in the ground in tunnels that they are reusing from different rodents. They get up in the morning, they head out, they gather some pollen, they bring it back to the nest, and they collect it until they have enough to combine in with some nectar, roll it into a ball, and then lay their egg on that little ball of bee bread, they call it. They then seal off that piece of the nest and start over again. I have here a little picture of a um, little bamboo strip that I had a mason bee nest in, and you can see the little balls of bee bread that she has formed as she's making her nest. You can see the world is grateful that I am not a surgeon because I did disrupt it a bit. You can see here's some of the mud cake that she put in place to seal off each little egg and little ball of bee bread. But it's fascinating. So, native bees really have a lot of bad press, and I think in order to really enhance our pollinator performance, we need to really tell a better story about native bees. So, what else? What is the other group of insects that's critical to our food web? Caterpillars. And again, that one is a surprise to many people. But caterpillars transfer more plant energy to animals than any other life form. So, more animals will eat caterpillars to get their plant energy than they will to eat plants or to eat other herbivores. And why is that? Why are caterpillars such an important energy transfer point? Well, one is that they're food for everyone. Everyone likes to eat them. Insects, birds, amphibians, and reptiles, mammals. The only thing, only I think just fish are missing. But I'm sure there's a fish somewhere that likes to eat caterpillars. Um, let's just look at one example with birds. Um, we all know that birds like to eat seeds, they eat berries, they eat insects, they eat worms, they eat all sorts of, vegetable and plant life. Um, but when they're raising their young, about 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America like to feed their young on insects, primarily caterpillars. Um, the story with the chickadee, that I'm sure a lot of you had heard from Doug Tallamy, is that one nesting pair of chickadees will require 6 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed their one nest, and bring them into fledglings. That's a lot of caterpillars. But it just goes to show the critical nature of the caterpillars in the ecosystem. Why is that again? Why are they such a popular food? One is they're slow and easy to catch. Um, their primary defense is camouflage. Um, and they're very good at that, but that's a totally separate talk. Some of them are slightly toxic, but they're really the better defense mechanism, that the best defense mechanism they have is camouflage. They're also very easy to eat. They're big. You can get one caterpillar is about the energy content of several hundred aphids. They're soft. There's no shells. Like beetles are actually more abundant, but getting rid of the shells and getting to the food is a lot more challenging. So they're big, soft bags of food. Um, they've taken the plant energy and converted it to a wonderful mix, a very nutritious mix of proteins, lipids, and other nutrients that the other animals eat and need. Um, and last but not least, caterpillars are simply eating machines. I mean, the sole purpose of a caterpillar is to eat. It's one of the interesting things about, metamorphosis is each phase or each stage has its own purpose. The butterflies and moths are there to reproduce, but the caterpillar's sole purpose is eating. Some caterpillars will increase in size over 72,000x in their lifetimes. So, eating machines, that's what we have. So, if we have those eating machines, why is there still plant life remaining? Um, well, plants may not be able to move, but they have evolved their own chemical defense systems. Those secondary metabolites, they're called, they're not used for anything uh, regarding to chemical energy conversion, but more for defense. Um, so they create these chemicals, and they in their leaves to deter herbivores from eating their leaves. Examples include caffeine, nicotine, quinine, digitalis, opiates, and tannins. Lots of chemicals we've heard of and that we use. And each genus of plants, and I think it's the discrimination at the genus level, develops their own unique chemistry, their own unique mix of chemicals to and deter herbivores from eating the plants. And that mechanism can either be that the leaves taste bad or they're actually toxic. So now the insects are not just standing by the sideway. They've been evolving along with the plants. Um, so they've developed the ability to get around these plant defenses. But it's not easy. In fact, it's quite difficult. And because of that, really, one species of caterpillar can really only develop a strategy to detoxify one genus of plant. And they call that genus their host plant. And that's the plant that they really need to survive. These caterpillars are called specialists, so there's 90% of them. One example that you're probably all familiar with is milkweed defenses, yes. So milkweeds create cardinalide glycosides as their protection mechanism. And they must be incredibly paranoid plants because cardinalide glycosides shut down the sodium potassium pump. And that's a system that's so important. I remember it from my biochemistry class in 1980. Um, so what it does is it the sodium potassium pump is essential for nerve and muscle function, and basically your heart stops. It's also effective in humans, but certainly if eaten in small amounts, but in large amounts, but in small amounts, certainly toxic to insects and different herbivores. If that isn't enough, it has the milk of the milkweed as a latex that will solidify on exposure to air and glue the caterpillar's jaws shut. So really, you'd think a pretty unbeatable defense system the plant is set up. But the caterpillar has developed a response. Firstly, they have enzymes they've developed that can detoxify those glycosides, so that they can tolerate them, and not only tolerate them, but they actually store some of them for their own defense, so that they themselves become somewhat toxic as well as, and that persists into the butterfly, the source of the toxicity of the monarch butterfly. To get around the latex, I took two pictures here. You can see of a monarch caterpillar in Central Park, and I just happened to catch two different approaches. But they basically break the stem that stops the flow of the latex into the leaf. You can see here he's broke the stem, and this one is just breaking the stem on the leaf to stop the flow of latex so they can then eat the leaf. And they say that's a good fingerprint that you can use to determine if a monarch caterpillar is nearby. So again, that's one example. So all caterpillars, 90% of caterpillars have that host plant connection, and they need in order to eat and reproduce. Now, 10% of the caterpillars can deal with multiple different native species in their defensive strategies, and they're called generalists, and I think we really ought to be studying them. I don't know what kind of incredible detoxification strategies they have to deal with so many different, if you look at this list up here, so many different toxic materials with one caterpillar. So to summarize, plants use the sun's energy to create food for life. And our two insects that are necessary for that food web, pollinators, keep the plants reproducing, and caterpillars transfer the most energy into that food web, but only when they can eat the native plants that they have co-evolved with. To flip that around, native plants are essential because without them, our own food webs and our ecosystems would collapse. So I go back to my yard again. Now, is it part of a functioning ecosystem? And the answer would be, well, not if it's in Niskayuna. It belongs somewhere in Asia, I believe. But is it really, really hopeless? I mean, what about those generalists? Nature is very resilient. Are there other tricks somewhere that make invasive plants less disruptive to ecosystems? Sadly, no. Let's see what's happening now. Research, this is by Doug Tallamy, where he and his graduate students looked at comparing a plot of invasive plants versus natives. And they found in the invasive filled plot, 68% fewer caterpillar species, 91% fewer caterpillars, and 96% less biomass of caterpillars. To me, that's just stunning. I think that was beyond expectations of the differences they were expecting between an invasive and native plants. And it's not just in the plants, but it's also with the berries in the plants. Berries' sole purpose is to attract different animals to eat them so that their seeds get well dispersed. So they've also co-evolved with the animals around them. Invasives, like the honeysuckle, the buckthorn, the barberry. Um, their berries in the fall are high sugar, so that must meet the needs of someone. But the native berries here are up to 50% fats, which is exactly what our overwintering and our migrating birds need in the fall. So even the berries, junk food berries here in my yard. Um, it truly is just this beautiful ornamental green wasteland. Sadly, my yard is just a microcosm of what's happening all around us. There's been a dramatic loss in habitat, whether it's through urbanization, suburbanization, industrialization. We've lost a lot of the habitat that we used to have. And when we do plant, we've been planting invasives. So the natives have this double whammy. Not only are they being losing habitat, but the habitat they have is being invaded by these naturalized invasives. Pesticide use is insane. They say that urban pesticides are use is greater than agricultural pesticide use, and that's all for us to make have our pretty green lawns. There are some unique issues, like, for example, light pollution, that are having huge impacts on the insect and bird population. And then, last but certainly not least, there's climate change. So, a pretty devastating set of circumstances. So, what are we seeing then? Just extinctions predicted everywhere, and just staggering loss in our biodiversity. It's almost too depressing to read about. And rather than going through this list, I'd like to just take the insects and the insect apocalypse and put it into a story. When I was young, we'd go out for in the drive. My mom would stop at the gas station in the summer, and she would spend as much time cleaning the windshield, or maybe more, than she would in getting gas. And sometimes, in fact, she stopped just solely to clean the windshield. But today, you can drive around for almost an entire summer and never need to clean your windshield. That's that's the insect apocalypse brought home. But we're all saying now, can I do something? What can I do? Is it as hopeless as it sounds? I really want to be able to do something. Um, the interesting and great thing is that a lot of these challenges or things that have gone wrong, I can fix in my own yard, and you can fix in yours. You can reduce the amount of turf grass, take out invasive, add native plants, stop using pesticides if you ever were, and deal with some of these, unique issues. So we can all do that, but would it matter? Is it enough? Can it make a difference? And thank goodness for Doug Tallamy, again, a professor at the University of Delaware. He started a nonprofit called Homegrown National Park, because he believes that is exactly the solution. Our current systems of parks in the U.S. isn't enough. Most of them are most area is west of the Mississippi, and a lot of the biodiversity we needed to protect is east of the Mississippi. In addition, about 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So there's not much hope of a new great big national park happening anytime soon. However, instead of lemons, he's turned that into lemonade, because that's the opportunity. If we could return 50% of our yards to natives, 50%, it would add over 20 million acres, which is more acreage than the national parks out west combined. But even more importantly, he stresses it will cause us to learn to live with nature. And instead of when we want to be out in nature, we go to a national park or a state park. Instead, it's in our yards. It's where we live. We live with it. We nurture it, we take care of it, and it takes care of us. That would be amazing. We'd be able to save the planet by just working in our own yards. So I was pumped. I'm ready. I'm on. So I came up with a plan. My hypothesis being that providing food and shelter to pollinators and caterpillars would lead to the recovery of my little, very local ecosystem. So obviously, the first thing is to take out those invasives, maybe in stages, and keep learning because I'm clearly a novice. Then the second year, once I'd cleared out, I'd start to plant native trees, shrubs, perennials, and relook at what I'm defining as weed. There's a cute joke as you can remove all the weeds from your yard without pesticides by just recalling them wildflowers. Um, and actually, I did have several wildflowers in my yard that I'd been weeding for a decade or two. Also, it's not just the food, but you have to make sure you've got, shelter and nesting areas for as well. Minimizing turf grass. Turf grass is about as ecologically valuable as concrete. Um, so replacing it as much as you can with area that is planted with perennials and native plants of all different types, whether it's ground cover, small herbaceous plants, with perennials, as well as understory plants, shrubs, and trees. Leave the leaves. I mean, that's so important. I'll come back to that later. Leave the garden mess is also important. Whether you're leaving the stems of the plants to make homes for those native bees, as we discussed, or whether you're leaving the seeds for the birds, leaving the mess at least through the winter into the spring and even afterward is really essential for creating shelter and nesting sites. And then mulching under your trees, you want to create soft landings for caterpillars. You want to keep the moisture in. You want to protect the life underneath the soil. Really important. So I thought I would get started. Why wait? I would never get it perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'll learn and I'll fix it and try again. So which natives do I want to plant? The master gardeners say right plant, right place. And when you're in the right place, native plants are very, very low maintenance, much lower maintenance than annuals and a lot of the plants people are used to having in their yards. And what you want to look at is the sun, water, and soil. I have pretty full sun in the backyard. It's relatively wet in the spring and then tends to dry out in the summer, but there is actually standing water in the spring, so I have to have some plants that don't mind the wet feet. And then my soil is mostly clay. I wanted to have a lot of diversity, as always. I have flowering in the spring, summer, and fall, as well as different types of plants that will be hosts for different types of insects. And caterpillars are very selective, as we've talked about with their host plants, but pollinators are significantly less. Just to make a point, while the monarch caterpillar requires milkweed, the monarch butterfly can pretty much get nectar from anywhere. Some native bees, however, are specialists and need pollen from just specific plants. Pollen is very unique characteristic of a plant. You can identify which plant the pollen comes from due to its morphology, its shape, its size, its content, the amino acids in the proteins, as well as the lipid and other nutrients. So it's not surprising that there would be some native bees that really do require specific pollen to raise their young. And as always, balance. You want to have, be able to provide the food, the shelter for a variety of different insects and then see what works. Again, still leaves a huge number to pick from. And so then the helpful concept of keystones comes in. Now, we've all agreed over and over again, say it again, caterpillars are essential for the food web. But it's not an even distribution. It turns out that only 14% of the native plants support greater than 90% of caterpillar species. Um, and they call those plants, those 14%, keystone plants. Now, why is this? There are lots of different theories, but one of them might be that they have a weaker defense system, a weaker chemical defense system than the other plants. For example, oaks, which top out the list, oaks have tannins as their primary chemical defense. And tannins taste bad, they're bitter, and they interrupt the uptake of protein in the animal, which are not pleasant, but they seem like they'd be a lot easier to overcome than death. So maybe that's, contributes to why a keystone plant might be so attractive to so many different species. So here's a list of trees. You can see trees dominate the list, but those herbaceous plants stick in there. Look at that, goldenrods, almost half of a maple, which is insane. Doug Tallamy says goldenrods and oaks are the two greatest gifts to the animal kingdom from the plant world. You can see they also here support specialist bees, so that makes some selections a lot easier for me. And here's what I started with. The bold are the keystones, some asters, sunflower, and goldenrods, and then the others are just specific host plants that I decided to plant for the benefits they could provide. And others I just liked. How cool are these guys? I mean, they look like there's some science fiction plants. The horse mint and buttonbush, one dry condition and one wet. Then you'll all say, and I hear it all the time, and it's very true, native plants are hard to find. Well, it's even more complex because first you need to define for yourself what's your definition of native. Is it native to North America, native to the US, native to New York, or native to the ecoregion? You need to really decide what's important to you. I started with native to New York and move in and out of the ecoregion depending on the flower itself. But there's no right and wrong. It's really how you want to proceed. Now we have a list of the master gardeners. We put together a list of places where you could get native plants. Sales that happened on an annual basis as well as nurseries, but unfortunately the website is down right now. They're renovating it, and we lost all those pages that we'd put up. So in the short term, I'd be happy to email them to you if you would like. So that's a short term, but long term, we need to get more native plants in our local nurseries, and they hopefully will respond to customer demand if we keep asking. So please keep asking for them to supply natives. So where I got most of my plants is through winter sowing. Now, seeds are a lot easier to get and also a lot cheaper than the native plants. You can find them at local seed swaps and it's really seed giveaways. You can get them online or you can collect your own if you know what you're doing. But winter sowing was a method I found out again through the Master Gardeners is an incredibly easy way to germinate seeds. I had never before in my life been able to germinate and get a healthy, a robust plant from seeds until I tried winter sowing. So I do not have a green thumb, but this is on the right what I got from my winter sowing, which simply is you take a milk jug and you make a little terrarium. You cut off the top, you cut holes in the bottom, you fill the bottom with soil, then you plant your seeds in the soil, you put the top back on, tape it up, and you set it outside in January and you wait, and in the spring, this is what you get on the right. And it's insane. I really, a couple of times I didn't really believe it would work. You see, I kind of planted a few too many seeds. But it really is a miraculous. It's not miraculous, it's just a simple terrarium. But anyway, it's really great the way it works. And I've used it to really plant most of the natives in my yard, even trees. And don't forget the trees. Um, by biomass alone, trees are the backbone of any ecosystem, and they provide a lot of different services that, including food and shelter for thousands of species. They're doing a study in England on the English oak, and they've determined that there are over 2,300 species um, are supported by that oak tree, and they're not even done. Despite trees being wind pollinated, if you look at a lot of bees in the spring, there around here in particular, there aren't that many flowers available yet for pollination, certainly not many natives. And so a lot of the early spring pollinators rely on trees and tree pollen for their food. Keystone trees, like oaks, support more caterpillar species than any other plant. So if you want to encourage caterpillars in your yard, keystone trees should be your first decision. Um, Obviously, they also do all these other, environmental services that we know so much about, sequestering and storing carbon, managing water, cleaning the air, cooling the environment, stabilizing soil. Um, they're just real workhorses in any ecosystem. And when you look at all of these benefits, oaks typically come out at the top of all of the lists, which leads Doug Tallamy again to have put out this little poster that the oak acorns are the grassroots solution to our biodiversity crisis. And I left the leaves. Now, I think that was a very important step. Leaves aren't litter. I think they're actually more interesting than turf grass, but I've been told that probably won't catch on. But quote unquote, they provide food, shelter, and nesting sites for butterflies, moths, beetles, bees, and more. And then there's more life beneath the leaves than above. Interestingly, 90% of caterpillars drop out of trees into the leaf litter to overwinter. They don't stay in the trees. And they overwinter either in the leaves themselves, forming a cocoon, or they burrow into the ground and overwinter there. But either way, they need that leaf litter to protect them. Now, there's been some research, very recent research at the University of Maryland, where they really wanted to make sure there's real science behind Leave the Leaves. No Mow May got to be a little bit iffy, but actually it's true. When they did compare plots where they left the leaves and didn't leave the leaf and raked away the leaves, um, variety of different yards in the Maryland area, they found 45% fewer caterpillars and fewer caterpillar species when they removed the leaves. So very simple, clear data to show the benefit of leaving the leaves to the caterpillars. It's okay to rake the leaves to preferred spots, out of the way spots, even a pile in the back, on the side, under the trees, wherever you want, but, please don't shred. So now for 2024, what is my yard going to look like? So I still have this dying elm, though we had to take it out last year. There's a power line across the back, so I really couldn't plant any trees. It gets very wet in the spring, and so I put a bunch of shrubs in that liked wet feet. Buttonbush, elderberry, red osier dogwood, and pussy willows. One Norway maple came down in a storm, and I planted a red oak. And there's our red oak Clifford right here. And then I made a perennial bed on the side by the garage. And we started with like something like this. I've enlarged it a bit since, but this is what I started with in 24. And the results are in. This is my perennial bed this year. This is early summer, midsummer over in the top right, and late summer in the bottom right. You can see they've just gone crazy. um, it's just gorgeous. I don't see why people think that native plant gardens aren't attractive. And some of these flowers, admittedly, don't last long, but others last for at least a month. So I had a surprise gift and some trout lilies that showed up. I don't know where they came from, but I think, getting rid of the invasive plants, let them get enough sun to shine. So that was pretty beautiful. I had a lot of new visitors and a lot of butterflies. Here are some that I actually saw and was able to get decent pictures of. The crescent butterflies. I have asters as their host plant, so obviously I was not surprised to see them. American painted lady butterfly, the hair streak butterfly, as well as several different skippers. Um, and I saw several monarchs. Beautiful butterflies, but you can see looking at this picture why they might not be the best pollinators. They have very long, smooth legs. They have a very long proboscis that allows them to stay well above the flower. And they have, again, a relatively smooth abdomen. Compare that to a bumblebee. Here's one short, legs with hairs on them to collect the pollen. They're basically swimming in the plant. This is both our Joe Pye weeds. You can see the bumblebee is swimming in the plant, and it's clear that the bumblebee will be picking up accidentally and on purpose a lot more pollen. Swallowtails, I think, are even more gorgeous than the monarchs. I had several of the Canadian swallowtails and only one of the black swallowtail in my yard. But I did get a picture of this one in Central Park, and I just thought it was so pretty and really highlighted, the anatomy of a butterfly, including the coiled proboscis in flight. This is its landing, the little hooked antenna, the long legs, and the beautiful color patterns. Now, moths are nocturnal, so I didn't expect to see a lot of them, but I saw one that was just amazing. It's a hummingbird clearwing moth. This moth flew by my head. I was stunned, and it is basically the size of a hummingbird, and you can see it hovering. Um, as its proboscis goes in and looks for nectar. You can see the clearly moth, feathery antennas that it has, as well as the hairier, fuzzier body than a butterfly. But amazing that it can, fly and hover just like a hummingbird, which is probably why it can afford to be out in the daylight. Most moths try to avoid daylight time predators by coming out at night, but I would guess that this guy's fast enough that he can avoid them. So next, I'd like to try a little moth night, one of those light and cheap, little experiments to see what kind of moths I actually do have in my backyard, and see how that changes with time. And native bees. I fell in love with bees. I can't believe, but I did. I really did. Particularly bumblebees. Um, David Goulson says that bumblebees are the intellectual giants of the insect world. And I just find that fascinating. Reading about them and the studies they've been doing on them, they can learn by watching each other. And if you believe National Geographic as a source of valid scientific experiments, reporting on scientific experiments, bumblebees can use tools. So if anyone's interested in that, I'd love to talk and look at that data more carefully. Because that would be amazing. Here we thought we were so special in using tools, and yet bumblebees have been able to master the use of tools to get food. Here on the left, you see this guy has been apparently hanging out with the wrong crowd. Um, because this plant is designed such that the bee will come underneath, get covered in pollen as it tries to reach the nectar down at the base of the plant, the flower. But this guy, has learned how to cheat from someone and come in and just grab the nectar from the back. So, again, intellectual giants. He's not going to waste his time, going in the hard way. Here's a common eastern bumblebee, and I just hate why call something a common anything. Why not just say they're the spectacularly wonderful eastern bumblebee? I think that would be more appropriate. But you can see here, she's got her hair is already coated with some pollen that she's been collecting as she goes from flower to flower. Here she's in some wood asters. This bee over here, I'm not exactly sure what it is. I don't think it's a bumblebee, but it is a native bee. We got the genus through iNaturalist, but we can't figure out what it is. But you can see again the pollen stored in the legs. I talked about the enthusiasm as a native bees for their pollen, and look at this one has gotten so far deep into the primrose he can barely find her way to get out. It was really entertaining to watch the bee kind of struggle around, twist around, and then finally be able to climb back out of the evening primrose. And more hardworking bees. This is how a bee should get nectar and pollen from a comfrey. And you can see this one has had to muscle in, almost like pulling the flower over its head to reach in and get to the pollen and nectar. You can see the pollen again collected on the leg that she already has. This one here, speaking of strength, I don't know what she's doing, but she's pulled over like four or five, it's hard to tell, little flowers from this bee balm. I don't know whether she's showing off or whether she's got some plan that, getting four at once is going to be more efficient than one at a time, but I thought that was adorable. It also happens that bees' wings beat so quickly, about 200 beats per minute, that they build up static charge as they fly. Um, they become positively charged, which attracts the negatively charged pollen. And I think this young lady must have flown in from New York City or somewhere, but she had quite the charge and really collected a lot of pollen. Um, you don't see this. It's the only time I've ever seen anything like this. So it'd be interesting to learn more about that. And then this one over here. Took a picture. I was watching this bee and thinking, what is it doing out there? Don't belong out there. Um, but when I read on it about it, it seems like she was taking a nap. And bees typically will do that. Just find somewhere, stay still for a bit, and then move on. And she certainly did. So, love those bees. In fact, I was so enjoying the bees, I hardly even paid attention to the birds, which had been my original goal. But they are coming back. I do expect to have, first, the caterpillars and some of the insects, then the birds. But we had a few anyway. There's some house wrens in both. I had two house wren houses that I got. And you can see here's mom or dad, I'm not sure which, ready to come in with an insect. Saw lots of different birds, especially a lot of fledgling birds that were fun to watch, learn how to eat at the bird feeder. And some of them stayed for the winter. Here I have a pair of American, what are they here? Got it here. American goldfinches, sorry. American goldfinches that actually were. I left the garden mess, and sure enough, they came by to eat the seeds, and that was pretty nice. I had some robins coming over winter for a couple hours. It was really strange. They were puffed up. They almost looked like Christmas ornaments. They were so puffed out, like balls. Clearly a cold day, but they hung around in the yard for a few hours, and then during the middle of the day, and then they left. Now, just to be honest, I did grow a few veggies in my yard, and I had the best tomato harvest I've ever had. Um, Now, bumblebees are best at, or I guess I'll start over again. Honeybees cannot pollinate a tomato plant. You need to have a bumblebee that can do the buzz pollination, or a native bee that can do the buzz pollination. That takes more strength to shake the flower and really cause the pollination to occur. Um, so that might have been one factor. I had my best harvest ever. Previous years, I'd had struggles with the tomato hornworms. Um, these caterpillars, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they're at least 3 inches big. They're bigger than any caterpillar really has a right to be. Um, and they will decimate a tomato plant in a very short time. And then it happened to me multiple times over the last several years. This year I was out in my garden and I saw this instead. And I almost screamed because it's again 3 inches long, and really bizarre. It was like some alien creature. Um, Grabbed my I naturalist, went back and looked at it, and what it is it's parasitoid wasp cocoons that are on a tomato hornworm caterpillar. And I was even lucky enough to hear I could catch this is the wasp coming hatching out of one of the cocoons. So they're a tiny little thing. Um, so what happens is when the tomatoes are bitten by the caterpillars, the leaves, it releases a chemical, another defensive chemical, that volatilizes into the air and attracts the wasp. The adult wasp comes, lays its eggs inside of the caterpillar. The larvae grow and eat within the caterpillar, and then when they're ready to pupate, they chew their way through, spin their cocoons, and the host dies. It's amazing. um, but it's one of the symptoms of natural control that you have pests, and the pests are controlled naturally by different natural predators. And if you have a working ecosystem, those predator prey situations can really work out well. Um, and it was happening in my own yard. So 25 was even better than 24. I had some new flowers come to really flourish. I'd taken them a year to get started. One was a showy goldenrod, the woodland sunflowers, and my New England asters were just tremendous. I had some new friends. Here's another clear wing moth. Um, I had the first toads probably in our yard ever. I don't think the kids had ever seen a toad in our yard. And I met an orb weaver, a certain large spider. I was out in the yard one day and I saw this like 6 foot diameter spider web, and I thought that's just doomed. Sure enough, the second day it was shredded. Come back the third day, rebuilt. The fourth day, it survived, and then the fifth day, it was gone again. And I think they took my advice and moved on. Um, so some new friends, but mostly I had more of my old buddies come back. You could hardly look at a plant without seeing, more than one bumblebee or more than one native bee on the flowers. There's some giant anise hyssop that was a super hit with the bees, the woodland sunflowers. I'd have, I think, 50 to 100 bumblebees just are buzzing around, coming and going. It was just a blast to watch. And then I actually saw two monarchs at once. And my yard is not a hotbed for monarchs, but I did see more than I had in the past. So that really felt good. So my backyard ecosystem was starting to function in just 2 years. I had at least 15 different species of butterflies, a couple of moths, but we'll see if there's more by looking in at night. Um, I had probably 15 plus different native bees, and those are just ones that were big enough for me to see. Most bees are smaller than the bumblebees, and so they would have been harder for me, a novice, amateur, um, and to see and photograph. I could usually only identify if I photograph them because it's just too hard otherwise. Um, we had some nesting native birds, our first toads on 1346 Regent Street, and an example where we had, natural prey predator systems that were working to balance the food web. I'm sure there's others. I'm sure there's many, many others, but that one was really rewarding to see, even though a bit gruesome. So my yard had become a fascinating place to be. There was just so much going on. It was hard to believe, and it felt, seeing it revive like that just felt soul good. I don't know where I heard that from before. I must have heard it somewhere, but it came to mind when I was thinking about, the change in my yard. Um, it was just felt like a weight was lifted. I was making a difference. Things could get better. It felt like the sun had come out, after months and months of gloom. I just can hardly put it into words. And it was all because I planted a few of those wonderful, beautiful native plants in my own backyard. So it's easy. If I can do it, anybody can do it if you have the time. Um, but not everybody, I realize, is retired. And so there are many things you can do, can be just as impactful without tearing up your yard. And I've tried to put down some of those ideas here on this page because, like Doug Tallamy, I really believe that we can do this one person at a time, one yard at a time. So I just want to say thank you. It was a bit difficult talking to the screen, but I think I recovered. Um, and I just want to say many thanks. I have a lot of people to be grateful for. I'm kind of self-taught in this area here, other than the master gardener volunteers, especially Janet, Kathy, Laura, and Angie. They've just been exceptional, patient as saints with me and my questions and my stupid ideas. Um, my sister Jeanette for encouraging me to start and to keep going. My husband Steve for digging in. He did most of the invasive removal, actually, to be honest, and for supporting me as I, rip up the yard. And um, it's been fun. I really appreciate his support. And of course, my assistant gardeners who always like digging holes, just never where I want them. Gracie and Lizzie. So with that, here are some of the my favorite resources. And again, here's my email. I'd love to chat with you about any ideas you have, any suggestions you have, any experiences you have, um, any advice you have. So I just love to learn, and people are the best way to learn, in my opinion. So thank you again.
Oh, Margaret, that was excellent.